evening. The Secular Student Alliance at BU and Campus Bible Fellowship would like to welcome you all to Does God Exist? A Great Debate. I'm Scott Starr, President of the Secular Student Alliance.
I'm Daniel Vangor, President of Campus Bible Fellowship. Welcome, and we've been planning this debate for months now, and we are really looking forward to finally commencing here tonight. We just have a few announcements for everyone here tonight. I'm sure as you all noticed, you had inserts in your programs, and on one side of the insert is for you to write a question. You can see on the top there are two check boxes, one for each speaker of who the question is directed to. During the program, there is a time for collecting questions. We're going to have everyone pass questions to the right-hand side of the aisle, and then we'll have people come collect them then. And then on the other side of that insert is for contact information if you would like to learn more about either of our groups here tonight.
The Secular Student Alliance has two upcoming events. The first one is this Wednesday at 6 o'clock in Fine Arts 247. And we're having a member give a short presentation on non-religiosity in African America. And on May 3rd, we're having a blood drive. I know there have been many blood drives on campus, but this one's going to be very good.
This week we'll have two events as follow-up to this debate, either continuing the discussion or just examining more evidence. And the first will be Monday at 7 in UU 255, and that will be led by Dave and Vicky McGrew. And on Thursday, April 26th at 7:30, we will have another follow-up event in UU 324, led by Dr. Ken Gardowski.
In case you guys have had trouble finding the bathrooms, they're on either side of the doors outside. So I believe men is on that side and women is on that side. I guess we'll introduce the speakers now. Matt Dillahunty is the president of the Atheist Community of Austin in Austin, Texas. He is a host of the live internet radio show, Nonprofits Radio. He is perhaps more famous for being a host of the Austin public access television show, The Atheist Experience.
Jay Lucas is the director. Jay Lucas is the director of the Isaac Backus Project, an apologetics ministry dedicated to equipping and encouraging Christians to declare and defend the gospel of Jesus Christ.
And finally, we have the moderator, Dr. Stephen Shoemaker, Dean of School of Arts and Sciences at Baptist Bible College.
Thank you. I'd like to welcome each and every one of you. I think it's a great opportunity. You think here's a debate, but arguably the most important question that we need to ask and answer for ourselves, and here at a university, SUNY Binghamton. And I think it's very appropriate that we have this debate here, considering the history of education and universities. It's rooted, right, in ancient Greek thought, classical Greek thought with the academy, but also think of all the contribution of the Christian tradition in preserving civilization through the Dark Ages, scholarship, High Middle Ages, debating these great questions. So there's a long, rich tradition. I think this is a great venue for this, and I think it's appropriate. Just a couple things, and I'll turn this over as quickly as possible to our debaters. First, and probably most importantly, take out your cell phone if you would, and for everyone's sake, render it harmless. All right. So please either put it on vibrate or even off. I think the world will survive if you are isolated from it for the few minutes that we have together. So thank you. Just to bring your attention to the schedule for this evening, I know it's out there, but just to go over it, we'll begin with an opening statement from each one of our debaters. That will go 20 minutes each. They're not required to use all 20 minutes, but we're going to limit them to 20 minutes. Then there will be a second statement of 8 minutes apiece. Now, after that, you'll see here that what we want to do is collect your questions, if you have any, at that time. So I know you want to be listening carefully, you want to enjoy the debate, but also it's really important that you have your questionnaire filled out and ready to be collected at that time. Also, again, on the back, if you'll see here, you got the questions on the one side. Please mark clearly whether it's for Matt Dillahunty or Jay Lucas. Make that clear. And then on the other side, if you would like more information to contact either one of these two student groups, you can put your name there, your email, and then indicate, whether it's Campus Bible Fellowship or Secular Student Alliance, okay? So please have that ready by the end of the second statement. Then we'll have a brief cross-examination time, 6 minutes, and then after that, we'll take a 10-minute break. Now, we ask, a group this size, a 10-minute break, that can easily kind of unravel, so make sure you get out. If you have to use the restroom, great, whatever, do what you need to do, but really try to get in here. We're going to try to keep the time, tight, so be in here ready with the 10 minutes within that time frame, all right? Then we will have a question and answer time, 3 questions each, closing statements of 5 minutes, and hopefully we'll be out of here in decent time. So without further ado, Jay Lucas will open with he'll begin with the opening statement.
Hello, everyone. I want to thank all of you for being here tonight. I want to thank the Campus Bible Fellowship and the Secular Student Alliance for organizing this debate. I especially want to thank Matt Dillahunty for his participation. And I can assure all of you that Matt is an outstanding spokesman for atheism. We are here to respond to the question, does God exist? I believe that God's existence is obvious to everyone, but I suspect no one will be satisfied with that claim unless it is accompanied by a sound argument. Before I give that argument, there are 4 important things of which to take note. First of all, I want to make clear that I am arguing for Christian theism. God has made himself known to us through the general revelation of nature, through the human moral conscience, which is active in each of us, through the special revelation of the Old and New Testaments, and most importantly, through the incarnation of the Son of God, Jesus Christ. Secondly, I want you to know in advance that I believe that tonight you will be listening to 2 theists debate. One, a confessing theist, and the other, a suppressing theist. You see, the Christian worldview teaches that those who profess atheism are actually theists who choose to suppress the knowledge of God which they possess. The Apostle Paul made this very argument in Romans chapter 1, and I believe that tonight Matt will give evidence of his suppressed theism in many ways. I am concerned that some of you might be offended by that claim, and since I have no desire to needlessly offend, I want to direct this third item to those of you who are non-Christians. I believe there is a tendency among many Christians that non-Christians should find offensive. What is this tendency? It is our selfish choice to stay silent and to bow to the desire to be affirmed by others. Please allow me to explain. A biblically informed Christian is someone who believes that the God we are discussing tonight can be known in a personal way through faith in Jesus Christ. The good news of Christianity is that God freely offers forgiveness of sin and will graciously grant the gift of eternal life to those who trust in Christ. Of course, the existence of good news implies that there is bad news. And the bad news is that we are all sinners who fall short of God's glory, and we're powerless to earn his forgiveness by our own efforts. And this is God's indictment against the human race, and our guilt before a holy God is the ultimate bad news. Now, whether you or not you accept that diagnosis is, of course, completely up to you. My point is that you would be justified to question the love and compassion of a Christian who believes that diagnosis and yet is unwilling to share those beliefs with his non-Christian neighbor. To my shame, I must admit that on more than one occasion, I have chosen to remain silent when there was an opportunity to share the good news. My love and compassion for people can be trumped by my fear of being disliked or ridiculed. I don't want that fear to prevail here tonight. Each of you has great value, and I want to once again thank you for choosing to be here. My fourth and final preliminary note is that I want you to know that my argument tonight will not focus on the traditional or popular evidences often used to prove that God exists. Evidences which support the historical reliability of the Bible, or the resurrection of Jesus Christ, the evidence of intelligent design in nature. All of these can be helpful, but how a person interprets that evidence will be controlled by his or her worldview and the presuppositions upon which that worldview is built. If we don't deal with worldviews, even the best of evidence will be limited in its usefulness. Now, Matt and I each have a worldview, and so do all of you. Our worldviews depend upon presuppositions, and we make use of them on a daily basis, even though many people are not fully aware of what their presuppositions are and how they operate. In that regard, presuppositions are like breathing. We all breathe, but we rarely stop to think about it, and most of us only have a minimal understanding of the mechanics of breathing. Presuppositions are foundational beliefs upon which we build our knowledge of the world around us and interpret our experience. Pre means before. So to presuppose or to have a presupposition is to think or believe one thing before you believe something else. Dr. John Frame defines it as follows, quote, "A presupposition is a belief that takes precedence over another and therefore serves as a criterion for another. An ultimate presupposition is a belief over which no other takes precedence," end quote. Now, a great example of the way in which presuppositions control our beliefs about God can be seen in comments made by atheist scholar Dr. Kai Nielsen. Regarding claims about the physical resurrection of Jesus, Nielsen said, quote, "Let us just suppose it is the case that Jesus rose from the dead. Suppose something like that really happened. Suppose there were good historical evidence for it. This would not show that there was an infinite, intelligible being. It wouldn't give you any way of being able to detect if there is a God. It would just be that a very strange thing happened, namely that somebody who had died came together again as a living human being," end quote. Now here we see our definition of a presupposition being illustrated by Dr. Nielsen. His presuppositional commitment to atheism takes such precedence that even Jesus' physical resurrection from the dead, although it would be considered strange, would in no way indicate the existence of God. Nielsen would insist that there must be a naturalistic explanation as yet undiscovered. Now, another striking example of how presuppositions work can be seen in the Second Humanist Manifesto. In its assessment of religion, the manifesto says, quote, "As non-theists, we begin with humans, not God, nature, not deity. Nature may indeed be broader and deeper than we now know. Any new discoveries, however, will but enlarge our knowledge of the natural," end quote. Notice how this atheistic presupposition works. It insists that any future discovery, no matter what it is, will only add to our knowledge of the natural. The possibility of any evidence for the supernatural is excluded in advance. If this sounds to you like a faith commitment, you're absolutely correct. I would also be quick to acknowledge my own presuppositional commitments within the Christian worldview. Have we arrived at an impasse? If all the arguments I present to Matt are filtered through his commitment to atheism, and if I filter all of Matt's arguments through my theistic presuppositions, is it even possible to have an honest debate? I believe it is possible to test presuppositions by doing an internal critique of the worldview a person has built with his or her presuppositions. In other words, let's assume, for the sake of argument, that the Christian God exists. Can a rationally consistent worldview be built upon that primary presupposition? And then let's also assume, for the sake of argument, that there is no God, that the universe is simply matter in motion. Can a rationally consistent worldview be built upon that primary presupposition? Since our time tonight is so limited, I think the best thing we can do is to test the presuppositions of both worldviews in an area to which all of us can relate. The human moral conscience is a very real thing, and every one of us has had the personal experience of our consciences testifying to us internally about the rightness of some actions and the wrongness of other actions. If anyone here tonight were to claim that he or she has never experienced a guilty conscience or has never felt morally vindicated when making a good choice, that person would be lying. The reality of the human moral conscience is something we all know to be true. Now, atheists who have given this phenomenon careful thought, they don't try to deny it. Instead, they try to make sense of it based upon their atheistic presuppositions. Before we consider how we explain our sense of right and wrong, let's remember their starting point. Atheist Carl Sagan, in the opening of his famous book, The Cosmos, wrote this, quote, "The cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be," end quote. In other words, the universe is strictly material in nature. It is matter in motion. In his essay, A Free Man's Worship, famed atheist Bertrand Russell wrote these words, quote, "Man is the product of causes that had no prevision of the end they were achieving. Man's origin, his growth, his hopes, his fears, his loves, and his beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collections of atoms." My friend, Dr. Will Provine of Cornell University, has debated on behalf of atheism at my church in Ohio. In an interview with Ben Stein, Will said this, quote, "No God, no life after death, no ultimate foundation for ethics, no ultimate meaning in life, and no human free will. You can't hope for there being any free will. There is no hope whatsoever of there being any deep meaning in human life. We live, we die, and we're gone. We're absolutely gone when we die," end quote. I give Dr. Provine credit for being honest about the implications of atheism in a strictly material universe. He is being consistent when he says there is no ultimate foundation for ethics. Dr. Provine agrees with Bertrand Russell's position that since man's existence is an unplanned accident in a material universe, even man's beliefs, and that would include his beliefs about morality, are but the outcome of electrochemical processes within the brain, and these are controlled by physical laws. In such a universe, there can be no free will. Now, another atheist who has explained the nature of morality in a material universe is eminent philosopher of science, Dr. Michael Ruse. Now, in his essay, Evolutionary Ethics, Ruse states this, quote, "The evolutionist case is that ethics is a collective illusion of the human race, fashioned and maintained by natural selection in order to promote individual reproduction. What is really important to the evolutionist case is the claim that ethics is an illusion, in as much as it persuades us that it has an objective reference," end quote. Now, Ruse has openly admitted that atheism provides no objective basis for ethics. He goes on to say, quote, "There are good biological reasons why it is part of our nature to objectify morality. If we did not regard it as binding, we would ignore it. It is precisely because we think that morality is more than mere subjective desires that we are led to obey it," end quote. Now, as an atheist, Ruse claims there are no objective grounds for morality, yet he acknowledges that deep inside each of us has an innate awareness that objective moral values exist. He assures us that we believe in objective morality because nature programmed us that way. Of course, now that we realize that evolution has tricked our minds into believing an illusion, but it is a helpful illusion because it persuades us that morality is objective and binding. I want to be sure that we all understand the difference between objective versus subjective morality and why it is vitally important. When we say that morality is objective, we mean that it corresponds to something which is external to the individual or group of individuals. The belief in objective morality is perfectly consistent with Christianity's most basic presupposition, which says that God exists, that he created us in his image, and has endowed us with moral consciences that internally testify to us about external standards of right and wrong. And that is why a moral value can be binding on two people. The rightness of a particular moral value is not dependent on the relative perception of the individual. It exists outside of the individual, and objectivity is what enables a moral value to be universal and absolute. When someone claims that all morality is subjective, he is saying that morality is relative to the individual or a community of individuals. There is no external, objectively true standard which is absolute and universal. Subjectivity is, well, it's what enables someone to say what is true or right for you does not have to be true for him. Earlier today, Matt and I agreed to the details of this debate with the understanding that we would both abide by these agreements. All of you came here tonight with the expectation that certain rules would be followed and the moderator would impartially enforce those rules. Now ask yourself this. If I were to now flagrantly violate those rules and blatantly break the promises I made to Matt and the debate organizers, would I be doing something truly wrong? If the ultimate foundation of morality is subjective, you would have no reliable grounds for criticizing me. Why can't I choose my own personal morality that says it's acceptable to use deceit if I can gain an advantage? You might not like it, and perhaps you could even impose consequences upon me, but I'll take my chances. However, Matt would be justified in viewing me as being under obligation to follow the rules if he borrows from my worldview. For in the Christian worldview, when a person gives his word, he is obligated to keep it. And to be a liar, it's not simply impolite, it's genuinely wrong. In an atheist world, there can be no such thing as universal, objective moral absolutes by which I can be judged to be in the wrong, no matter how egregious my lies. Remember, atheist philosopher Dr. Michael Roos has told us that ethics is a collective illusion. Natural selection has programmed us to believe that ethics is objective and that it is more than mere subjective desires, but this is an illusion. We can recognize this as being an illusion because now that we've done away with God, we understand there's no basis for objective moral absolutes. This is what Will Provine recognized when he said there is no ultimate foundation for ethics. It's what Bertrand Russell understood when he said that man's beliefs, and that would include his moral beliefs, are but the outcome of an accidental arrangement of atoms. If I engage in a series of lies here tonight, I believe Matt has just two logical responses available to him. Now first, he can justly condemn me by holding me to an objective universal standard of thou shalt not lie. Now of course, to do this, he's going to need to borrow from my worldview, the very thing he denies. Or he must protect atheism by denying the existence of objective moral values in keeping with the atheist scholars I've already cited. I believe these are the only two logical options available to him. Nevertheless, in the past, Matt has tried to chart a third course, one where he repeatedly denies being a moral relativist and makes some sort of appeal to objective standards. The problem is that Matt is still trapped in the subjectivity predicted by Dr. Roos. In his lecture, The Superiority of Secular Morality, available on YouTube, Matt explained his utilitarian approach to ethics. In explaining how he would justify a moral value, he said this, quote, "In secular systems, the source of core values is internal to the system. Their authority comes from the participants by agreement and are justified by the fact that it works," end quote. The central claim of utilitarianism is that the rightness or usefulness of a moral action is determined by finding the greatest good for the greatest number. Now, of course, this formula is hopelessly mired in subjectivity. Who gets to define what counts as being good? Does a simple majority need to benefit, or an overwhelming majority in order to justify calling something good? What percentage? Who gets to say? How could we ever calculate all of the unknown variables that occur within a long string of moral actions? I guarantee you that by using Matt's utilitarian ethic, I could justify telling countless lies here tonight and imprisoning all atheists. And none of us would accept that as being just or moral. Now let's take this analysis a bit further and make it personal to each of you. I invite all of you to take a moment and think about the most unjust, unethical, or immoral thing that someone has done to you or to someone you love. I don't make this request lightly because I know that many of you or some of you here have painful memories, perhaps involving sexual abuse or betrayal by someone you trusted or malicious words said to or about you that were intended to wound and hurt you. Perhaps a partner knew they had an STD and did not tell you and did not protect you from it. Maybe one of your parents abandoned you to pursue a selfish desire. Folks, with all due respect and as gently as I can, I want to ask you if that act against you or that loved one was genuinely wrong. Is your assessment that it was wrong based on a binding objective standard of morality to which the other person was morally obligated? What if the offending person said that your assessment is just a personal opinion and that in their opinion, what they did to you is perfectly acceptable? Remember, the claim being made here tonight is not that atheists don't do good and morally commendable things. Of course they do. I like this guy. I think he's a good man. And we can identify something as being good and morally commendable because objective standards which make that identification possible do exist. But for Matt to appeal to these objective standards, as he has done in other settings, requires that he reject the logical implications of his own atheistic presuppositions, that he reject the atheist scholars I've already cited who understand that an atheist universe rules out the existence of objective morality. And when I consider that unwarranted leap, I am forced to conclude that I do not have enough faith to be an atheist. Thank you.
Hi. So first of all, I have to move the mic a little bit. Can everybody hear me? Okay. First of all, thank you very much for coming, and thanks to the event organizers for putting this together, both the Secular Student Alliance and is it College Bible Fellowship? Campus Bible Fellowship. They didn't invite me. And especially thanks to Steve for moderating as well. I had the chance to meet Jay this morning and wanted to thank him for agreeing to do this and thank him for sending everybody to go watch my talk on the superiority of secular morality, even if he slightly misrepresents it. Not the quote's accurate. So I find it a bit curious that we're still debating this subject in the 21st century. We've probably been debating the existence of God for as long as humankind's been able to consider the subject. At the time the very first person proposed the idea that a God existed, there was probably somebody on the sideline going, I don't think you're right there. And some might argue that this alone demonstrates that the affirmative position has consistently failed to meet its burden of proof. I won't actually be making that point today. I want to start tonight by talking about why and how we find something believable, justifiably believable. We tend to live our lives primarily on inference and induction. Today is remarkably similar to yesterday. Dramatic changes in the world that we inhabit are either rare or they occur at time scales that are simply beyond our perception. We build up an internal model of the universe based on the experiences we have, the information that we encounter, and we use this information to make decisions, and we're really, really good at it. We're so good at quickly processing information about our situation, making decisions about reality, that we often proceed without any deliberate thought. We might even refer to it as instinct, or you've trained your visceral reactions. This situation is a little like that situation, this claim's a little like that claim, a quick visceral analogy, and we're ready to make a decision. And the decisions we make are very often, if not most often, correct. This is great. We got really cool brains. The problem is, this is also really, really dangerous. It's a huge problem because what it does is it causes us to overestimate our intelligence. It causes us to overestimate our level of knowledge, and our ability to use deductive reasoning is poisoned by hidden biases, presuppositions, and misunderstandings. The famous study that showed that most people think they're of above average intelligence kind of demonstrates that, I think. What this means is that while I'd like to believe I'm presenting a novel approach to the subject of this debate, I don't know enough to actually claim that it's a novel approach, but I do know enough to know that I don't know enough to claim that it's a novel approach, and that's good. There's another wonderful aspect of thought that I want to quickly address, and that's language. We've developed the ability to communicate, to convey concepts and ideas in a way that's understood by others. I don't know why I got so pedantic and defined communication, but I think it's fair to say that we're really good at this as well, at least compared to other intelligent animals. I'm willing to bet that with very few exceptions, each of you has understood everything I've said without any deliberate thought about, hey, what did he mean by that? Or at least not too much of it, I hope. We can do this for specific words, but at this point in the talk I've used hundreds of words, and I doubt many of you have had to actually process all of them deliberately. We make use of inference and induction in language to assess context for concepts that we don't understand. And we're really good at that too. Because of our reliance on inference and induction, our ability to communicate causes problems. Consider the question of this debate. Does God exist? 3 words. In most debates about the existence of God, actually, let me back up for a second. Does God exist? I think we can easily dismiss the first word of the debate without getting into Clinton-esque questions of what does mean. But if we need to discuss it, we can. The second word, though, is God. In most debates about the existence of God, we find the affirmative position arguing for rather abstract deistic God. That's not what we've seen here tonight. And that's perfectly acceptable, and I wrote this ahead of time. I wouldn't have held Jay to defending necessarily Christian theology because that wasn't what the subject of the debate was. But he's welcome to do it, and I have no objections there either. The point being that Muslims will have a different God concept than Christians, who will have a different God concept from Hindus. And so quite often, these debates become a process of smuggling in baggage by arguing for an abstract God. The third word in tonight's debate, though, is exists. And that's where I have the biggest problem. I've tried, but I can't find a single topic other than the God question where the word exist means anything other than is real. In many of these debates, and possibly here tonight, there's another usage for exist. We haven't really gotten to the nuts and bolts of what Jay defines as God other than the abstract Christian concept, which I think smuggles in some baggage as well. But believers will often say that their God exists outside of space and time, and yet dips into space and time as well. I don't know what that means. Existence is necessarily a temporal concept. To exist, something occupies time. When something is real within reality, it occupies space and time, at least briefly. And to say that something exists outside of space and time doesn't even make any sense. Would it make sense to say that something existed for 0 seconds or -2 seconds? Maybe it's just me. I can't quite process that. And I'm not simply arguing for theological non-cognitivism. This is a real issue with the subject of the debate. It is, I believe, another cheat, a sort of equivocation fallacy, to say God exists as the conclusion of an argument when the God that you've demonstrated isn't necessarily the same one that somebody else has a concept of. And certainly, the way the word exist was used doesn't seem to map to any other usage of exist. I don't even know what it means to say that something exists outside space and time. And I'll point out that Jay hasn't actually argued that because we haven't gotten to the specifics of his God. But the curious thing about this is that like I said, believers will often say their God exists outside of space and time and dips into space and time. There's two possibilities, by the way. Either God exists or no God exists. Those are really the only two possibilities. On the subject of a God that exists, there's two further possibilities, and one is that a God exists and does not manifest in reality in any way. That God is entirely indistinguishable from a God which doesn't exist, so there's no point in talking about it. And then the other option being a God that does manifest in reality in some way, which makes it a testable hypothesis that is potentially detectable. There's a caveat on the God that exists and messes around in reality, and that is that some would say that this God intentionally hides the evidence of its messing around in reality, which I argue makes it indistinguishable from the God who doesn't interact with reality. So if we're going to be talking about a God, and clearly we're talking about the Christian God tonight, we must be arguing for a God who manifests in reality in some detectable fashion. That's good, because those who would be arguing for a God that doesn't manifest, we're back to, I don't understand what you're saying. I don't understand how you came to this idea in the first place. You had to have detected something. And actually, Jay would be arguing for the detection of some things, perhaps our moral sense being the bulk of it. Let me kind of step aside for half a second. How many people here believe that extraterrestrials are visiting Earth and abducting our citizens and cows? Wow. I believe you're being a contrarian. No. Yeah, I didn't see any real hands, and that's fine. But why don't you believe? Are you aware that you can talk to people, living, breathing people, who will tell you the story of their abduction? I'm not just talking about one or two people here. There's many people who will give you their independent accounts. These people haven't met, and their accounts bear remarkable similarities. Are you aware that entire villages have reported seeing spaceships, alien spacecraft? And before you think I've gone off the deep end, I don't believe that aliens are coming here and abducting either. But I'm talking about the question of why we don't believe. Are you familiar with things like the Drake equation, which is an attempt to establish the probability that Earth is the only place in the universe where life is formed? When we look at the scientific evidence at first blush, there's no reason to think that it's impossible that aliens are visiting Earth. It's certainly not impossible that they exist. Matter of fact, if the Drake equation is accurate, it's absurdly arrogant and improbable to claim that Earth is the only place with life. But I believe it's probable that there's life elsewhere in the universe. I don't know how probable. I don't know if there's intelligent life. I don't know if it's still here. I don't think it's relevant. I'm going to move on from aliens. But that's an example of a claim, and that's what I'm getting at. How do we go about finding out if that's true? Why don't I believe that aliens are coming here? Can I prove that it's false? No. I can't prove that aliens aren't abducting citizens and cows. I also can't prove that a God doesn't exist. And if you came here expecting me to prove that there's no God, you've come to the wrong place. That's not how the burden of proof works, and that's not necessarily the atheist position. One of the best examples of the burden of proof is to consider a court case analogy, where we present evidence and arguments in an attempt to prove our claims. We have different standards of evidence for different claims. You may have to demonstrate it beyond a reasonable doubt or to a reasonable certainty or to a preponderance of the evidence. In a murder trial, the defendant is, as a matter of fact, either guilty or innocent. They either killed that person or they did not. But what you believe about their guilt or innocence is a different question. And in a court, the question is one of guilt. And I scrolled too far. The jury isn't required to vote guilty or innocent. They vote guilty or not guilty. They're not addressing a question of innocence at all. They're addressing the question of guilt. And a not guilty vote doesn't mean the juror is convinced the defendant is innocent, though they might be. It simply means they're not convinced the defendant's guilty. No one's going to take someone to court to prove their innocence of something that they haven't been accused of. The accusation, the guilt claim, necessarily comes first. I'm here tonight because I find the defendant, God, not guilty of existing. Let me address a couple points about logical arguments for a moment. How am I doing on time? Okay. So when we're talking about logical arguments, you can look at them as being addressed by two different characteristics, validity and soundness. And I apologize if this is overly pedantic for a college crowd, but validity addresses the structure of a syllogism, the structure of an argument. And a logically valid argument is one where true premises necessarily lead to a true conclusion. This is the foundation of how we go about reasoning. And we've got Aristotle and his students to thank for examining all of the syllogistic forms, determining which ones are valid. They even named the 24 that are valid, etc. And so you can take the famous example of a syllogism, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Everybody's probably heard that. If not, I'm glad to teach you something new. There are ways of reforming this that produce errors. For example, all men are mortal, Socrates is mortal, therefore Socrates is all men. Well, that's rather troubling. Some errors aren't quite so easy to spot. All men are mortal, Socrates is mortal, therefore Socrates is a man. Is that valid? No. Socrates could be a dog. And they went through this process of demonstrating which syllogistic forms are valid. The other prong of addressing a syllogism is soundness. That's where we get into real trouble. The soundness of an argument is dependent on whether or not the premises are actually true. This is where our reliance on inference, induction, intuition, coupled with problems relating to language and our presuppositions allow us to disguise our biases and presupposition. We have to be especially vigilant in questioning the premises and not merely assuming them to be true. A logical argument isn't simply true until it's disproved. The premises must be demonstrated to be true, and that requires supporting evidence. It's a fallacy to assert that one's argument stands until it's demonstrated to be false. And you can be convinced of its truth forever without knowing a single thing about whether or not it's actually true. No argument without supporting evidence can ever substantiate an existential claim that something necessarily exists within reality. We have to have evidence, and we must be, in this case, talking about a God that manifests in reality, and I think that Jay agrees with me because he's offering demonstrations that our moral sense, to the extent that we have them, is something that manifests in God and manifests in reality and requires a God for an explanation. This position about logical arguments and their reliability is true. The fact that we need evidence is true. Whether we're talking about a God existing or aliens existing, that's why this debate has raged throughout history. It's why there's no Nobel Prize for discovering the existence of God. There's no conspiracy against the God claims. They might even be true depending on the definition of God and existence, but there's no reliable confirmation. They don't withstand the level of scrutiny that we apply to every other claim. Not only is there no extraordinary evidence to go along with this extraordinary claim, there's little more than anecdotal evidence and considerable evidence against the claims. The case for God hasn't met the standards of demonstration beyond all reasonable doubt or to a reasonable certainty or even to a preponderance of the evidence. In fact, I'd submit that we don't even have probable cause to make the case to begin with. Laplace famously told Napoleon that he had no need of the God hypothesis when he was putting together his model of celestial mechanics, and I don't see that that situation has changed. We live in a universe where the following facts are, as far as I can tell, undisputed. People make mistakes. People are curious and seek explanations. People have continuously proposed magical explanations like God did it to fill in the gaps of our knowledge. People have invented gods for a variety of purposes, both as intentional frauds and as mistakes. People believe this about every God except the one they believe in. The God claims can't all be right, but they can all be wrong. None have ever been demonstrated to be actually true. Inferring design or intentionality or a moral sense doesn't actually confirm that that is true. And when a gap in our knowledge that was previously filled with the claim God did it has been investigated and a reliable evidence-based explanation has been found, that explanation has never been God did it. And it's not merely because science blocks out claims of the supernatural. We can test supernatural claims. The James Randi Educational Foundation has been doing this for ages. Science doesn't rely on philosophical naturalism. It relies on methodological naturalism, which means it doesn't presuppose that the supernatural doesn't exist, just that we can't tell anything specific about the supernatural. If a phenomenon is present and detectable, we should be able to find that. Can we assert then that a supernatural cause is responsible? And within science, the claim is no, we cannot make this assertion. It is not an assertion that the claim is not supernatural. It's a claim that we can't demonstrate that it is. Given those facts, I might be tempted to argue that one could be rationally justified in believing, though not claiming as certain, that no gods exist, which isn't a position I'm necessarily required to defend, although I do hold it. However, that's not what I'm here to do. Given those facts, I find that it is utterly irrational to conclude that a God does exist and that we should all find the defendant not guilty of existing.
As I said earlier, Matt is an outstanding spokesman for atheism. And you just heard firsthand why the Secular Student Alliance thinks so highly of him. In keeping with my opening statement, let's now assume for the sake of the argument that the case that Matt just presented for the non-existence of God is compelling. I don't believe it to be compelling, but nevertheless, let's just grant that he made his case. Now that we've given up God, there are many other things that in order to be rationally consistent, we must give up as well. One of the first things to go is objective moral values, and perhaps you're okay with this. I've already quoted several atheist scholars who agree that morality is not objective. However, this admission is such a problem for atheism that in recent years, some atheists have tried to argue for objective morality in an atheist world. But not only does that pit them against their fellow atheists, it flies in the face of common sense. But what difference does all this make in your life? In my opening, I asked you to recall the most unjust, unethical, or immoral thing that someone has done to you or to someone you love. And please understand, this request is not some cheap debate topic or tactic, nor is it an appeal to emotion. But we are here to consider one of the most important questions the human heart can ask, and this requires that we test worldviews. Now then, that unjust, unethical, or immoral thing that was inflicted upon you can only be identified as being wrong if there is some standard that both you and the offending person is bound to or morally obligated to honor. What is that standard, and where does it come from? Since we live in an atheist universe, the best answer to us is to say that within a particular community or society, well, there's an agreed upon code of conduct that seems reasonable if we are to happily coexist. And to that answer, the person who hurt you can simply say, well, those are your standards and values, not mine. You have your morality, I have mine, and in my system, passing on an STD to an unwitting partner is acceptable because the pleasure I derive from unprotected sex. My pleasure is the highest good. So what I did actually counts as being morally good, at least in my system. Now, how would you respond? You might say to your offender, well, what if everyone thought like that? What if everyone thought that his own pleasure was the highest good? To which he would say, every day, countless millions of people act on that very principle in a variety of ways, so why can't I? In our atheist world, our only appeal is to some sort of utilitarian system, but because utilitarianism is subjective, it really has no moral oughtness attached to it. Oh, by the way, add the concept of moral oughtness to the scrap heap. It simply does not comport with secular systems of morality. In Matt's lecture on the superiority of secular morality, he said, quote, secular systems have as a goal the best interest of the participants, end quote. Really? Try telling that to the relatives of the millions of people killed in the secular system known as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics under the rule of Joseph Stalin and his successors. Can you hold the clock just for a few seconds?
Yeah, give him time.
Okay. My college roommate married a young Ukrainian woman whose name was Lisa Vins. Her father, Georgie, spent many years being tortured in communist prisons because as a Baptist pastor, in trying to be true to his conscience, he would not register with the abomination known as the Soviet state-approved church. Let's look into that. You see, now that we have given up God, it is not just objective moral values that we must surrender. Objective human rights are now placed on the scrap heap as well. In his book, Rights from Wrongs, Harvard professor of law Alan Dershowitz, a committed atheist, writes, quote, "We are creatures of accidental forces who have no preordained destiny or purpose. We must make our own destiny and determine our own purposes," end quote. Now, in keeping with this view, Dershowitz goes on to say, quote, "We cannot endure without morality, law, and rights, yet they do not exist unless we bring them into existence," end quote. According to Dershowitz, rights are legal constructs devised by the minds of human beings. I hope everyone here recognizes that you have just lost any rationally consistent basis for universal human rights. They simply cannot exist in an atheist world, and that includes an inherent right to life. If you are an atheist, you cannot believe that you possess an inherent right to life. While we're at it, let's consider another thing that we must give up: justice. Since morality, law, and rights do not exist unless we bring them into existence, any standard we attach to the concept of justice is arbitrary and subjective and has no intrinsic or binding authority. Let's consider a woman in China pregnant with her second child. Does she have an inherent right to give birth to her child? Not in China, she doesn't. Although it is not uniformly enforced, every day women in China are forced to have abortions. Is this an injustice? No, it is not. At least not in a godless universe. Who are we to judge the utilitarian ethic of another society? I am concerned there might be some people in this room who have no problem with what went on in the Soviet gulags or what is happening in China. It is possible for our moral consciences to become so wounded that we become insensitive to the plight of others. If you are in that camp, I invite you to revisit that unjust, unethical, or immoral thing that was done to you or to someone you love. Are you ready to concede that your sense that the offender was genuinely wrong has no rational standing in an atheist universe? Now, you can hold onto the emotional experience of feeling that you were truly wronged, but that's all you have. A painful emotion that actually results from the electrical chemical processes occurring in your brain that is the byproduct of an unplanned and accidental arrangement of atoms in a purposeless universe. The unpleasant consequences of a worldview do not automatically count as a refutation of that worldview. My argument tonight is not that atheism is refuted by its being exposed as lacking any ultimate foundation for morality, human rights, justice, and a host of other things we don't have time to consider. The Christian worldview says that those who profess atheism are actually suppressing the knowledge of God which they possess. That is why they instinctively believe in many things which cannot be justified in an atheist universe. Try as they might, they cannot construct a rationally consistent worldview which simultaneously comports with human experience, especially that of the human moral conscience, unless they borrow capital from the Christian worldview. Although it was written nearly 3,000 years ago, I believe what this Hebrew proverb says about the secular heart and mind is still true. There is a way that seems right unto a man, but the end thereof is death.
So now we get to test if what Jay actually said about me is true, because while this is technically the second statement, I viewed it as a rebuttal, so I didn't actually prepare anything, and this is just my first chance to respond to what Jay said. and before we actually start, well, because this isn't part of the argument, I think debates are exactly backward in their time structure, because it's easy to say something in 30 seconds. It might take 30 minutes to refute, and yet we give 20 minutes and then 8 minutes to respond. But I'm going to lobby for that change in future debates, maybe. So, in a nutshell, Jay's position is that God must exist, otherwise Jay's living in a world that doesn't match the world he wants to live in. That really is the summation. I don't understand how you can trash talk consequentialism when that is essentially what the position is. He started off initially talking about how he was going to be defending specifically Christian theism. I'm glad we didn't get into, the existence of Jesus or the claims, specific biblical claims, although we may address some of them certainly in a little bit. I didn't come here. I've given the lecture on the superiority of secular morality. I didn't really come here prepared to do an entire dissertation on morality, but I will. First of all, I don't even want to start. Secular isn't some monolithic, all-inclusive thing. The fact that one particular view is secular doesn't mean that it's consistent with another secular view, which I think Jay would actually agree with since he's talking about subjective views. So to try to pit the atrocities of Soviet Russia or any other secular government up against what modern secularists are talking about with respect to morality is almost unconscionable. What they had in Russia was something akin to religion. You need something very much like religion, something dogmatic, which is that the state is God, in order to impose those things. And Jay continually refers to atheism as if it's something, as if it's a worldview. It's not. Atheism is not my worldview. Atheism is my position on the question of the existence of God. It is derived from my worldview, one of my labels for worldview, which is skepticism, and it is consistent with my secular humanism. And when I'm talking about secular morality, I'm talking about something along the lines of secular humanism, and I defy anyone to demonstrate that Soviet Russia was secular humanist or any of the other supposed problems. So when we look at this, there's this objection that without God you don't have free will. Okay, I didn't come here to do a free will debate, but you do realize that that question is up for debate and that there are many people who would assert that we don't have free will, or at a minimum we don't have the libertarian free will that some theists would propose. And I'd argue also that given certain specific definitions of the Christian God, you don't have free will under that God. If you believe in a God who exists and knows everything that will happen and knew it at the time of creation and specifically created this universe, and that he had options of other universes that he could have created, then you believe in a God that specifically picked this universe knowing that I would be an atheist and knowing that I would be saying these very words here. So wherein lies free will in that model? The question of whether or not we have free will is a question for another debate. I don't see it as an actual problem here. And the secular morality that I'm advocating is one that you can begin with very simply. And I would argue that we have. Something as simple as fire, hot, bad is a good start. The self-preservation instinct, hey, this is wrong, this is bad, this is harmful. And so we conflate that into something that is right or wrong. Right and wrong are evaluations that we make of actions with respect to goals, and we consider the consequences actually of those actions with respect to the goals. It's not entirely simplistic consequentialism. I haven't advocated, that's annoying. I haven't advocated simple consequentialism. Sam Harris, who wrote The Moral Landscape, hasn't either. But Jay talks about this innate awareness of morality that we have. Well, these moral instincts that we supposedly have don't all seem to agree. And they not only don't agree now, you can go to people and ask them what they think about a particular issue that's a moral issue, and you can get a variety of different answers. They don't match up with respect to time. What was immoral 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago has changed. That doesn't mean that what is truly moral has changed. What we're talking about changing here is what those people's perceptions of morality is, or perceptions are. I do that sometimes. I am not, as he's pointed out, a moral relativist. I don't believe that something's moral just because, 3 minutes, wow, just because your culture says it's correct. One of the examples that I've used for talking about secular morality is a chessboard. Take a mid-game chess position and present it to a bunch of people who are experts in chess and some people who aren't, and ask them what's the best move. You may get a variety of answers. There may actually be a variety of best moves. And the answer to that question may have been different hundreds of years ago or 150 years ago when we didn't quite know as much about chess. The fact that we don't know everything, the fact that we cannot see all of the possibilities is not this terrifying prospect that Jay wants to make it out to be. It is actually an opportunity, and it requires us to actually study and learn about the reality we inhabit. That is how we got better at chess. That is how we get better at morality. The fact that you might get different answers doesn't mean that there's not an answer. Doesn't mean that there's not an answer that we may eventually find that is better. But there can be many good answers, and still the one person who's sitting over to the side saying, hey, you should just tip your king over, we don't have to consider that person, their input in processing, because they have clearly demonstrated that they do not understand the rules of the game. And by rules of the game, I'm not talking about rules in the chess analogy fails because it's prescriptive, it was designed, but it doesn't matter if these are ultimately arbitrary or if they're by consensus or what. We inhabit reality. And reality has certain physical rules. There's certain things I can and can't do. If I punch you in the nose, it's going to hurt you. And I'd rather live in a world where people agree that we probably shouldn't run around punching each other in the nose. I don't even see that this is that hard. But when we get into debates about morality and people make claims about, oh, without a God, we can't have any objective moral standards, that's just hogwash. You can. It's a search, it's a process. And the fact that we don't have all the answers now doesn't mean we're not going to. Also, I'll point out that sticking God said so in as your objective moral standard doesn't resolve a single problem that Jay raised. It's no different from saying, because Matt said so. So now we get to test if what Jay actually said about me is true, because while this is technically the second statement, I viewed it as a rebuttal, so I didn't actually prepare anything, and this is just my first chance to respond to what Jay said. And before we actually start, well, because this isn't part of the argument, I think debates are exactly backward in their time structure, because it's easy to say something in 30 seconds that might take 30 minutes to refute, and yet we give 20 minutes and then 8 minutes to respond. But I'm going to lobby for that change in future debates, maybe. So, in a nutshell, Jay's position is that God must exist, otherwise Jay's living in a world that doesn't match the world he wants to live in. That really is the summation. I don't understand how you can trash talk consequentialism when that is essentially what the position is. He started off initially talking about how he was going to be defending specifically Christian theism. I'm glad we didn't get into, the existence of Jesus or the claims, specific biblical claims, although we may address some of them certainly in a little bit. I didn't come here. I've given the lecture on the superiority of secular morality. I didn't really come here prepared to do an entire dissertation on morality, but I will. First of all, I don't even want to start. Secular isn't some monolithic, all-inclusive thing. The fact that one particular view is secular doesn't mean that it's consistent with another secular view, which I think Jay would actually agree with since he's talking about subjective views. So to try to pit the atrocities of Soviet Russia or any other secular government up against what modern secularists are talking about with respect to morality is almost unconscionable. What they had in Russia was something akin to religion. You need something very much like religion, something dogmatic, which is that the state is God, in order to impose those things. And Jay continually refers to atheism as if it's something, as if it's a worldview. It's not. Atheism is not my worldview. Atheism is my position on the question of the existence of God. It is derived from my worldview, one of my labels for worldview, which is skepticism, and it is consistent with my secular humanism. And when I'm talking about secular morality, I'm talking about something along the lines of secular humanism, and I defy anyone to demonstrate that Soviet Russia was secular humanist or any of the other supposed problems. So when we look at this, there's this objection that without God you don't have free will. Okay, I didn't come here to do a free will debate, but you do realize that that question is up for debate and that there are many people who would assert that we don't have free will, or at a minimum we don't have the libertarian free will that some theists would propose. And I'd argue also that given certain specific definitions of the Christian God, you don't have free will under that God. If you believe in a God who exists and knows everything that will happen and knew it at the time of creation and specifically created this universe, and that he had options of other universes that he could have created, then you believe in a God that specifically picked the universe picked this universe knowing that I would be an atheist and knowing that I would be saying these very words here. So wherein lies free will in that model? The question of whether or not we have free will is a question for another debate. I don't see it as an actual problem here. And the secular morality that I'm advocating is one that you can begin with very simply. And I would argue that we have. Something as simple as fire, hot, bad is a good start. The self-preservation instinct, hey, this is wrong, this is bad, this is harmful. And so we conflate that into something that is right or wrong. Right and wrong are evaluations that we make of actions with respect to goals, and we consider the consequences actually of those actions with respect to the goals. It's not entirely simplistic consequentialism. I haven't advocated, that's annoying. I haven't advocated simple consequentialism. Sam Harris, who wrote The Moral Landscape, hasn't either. But Jay talks about this innate awareness of morality that we have. Well, these moral instincts that we supposedly have don't all seem to agree. And they not only don't agree now, you can go to people and ask them what they think about a particular issue that's a moral issue, and you can get a variety of different answers. They don't match up with respect to time. What was immoral 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago has changed. That doesn't mean that what is truly moral has changed. What we're talking about changing here is what those people's perceptions of morality is, or perceptions are. I do that sometimes. I am not, as he's pointed out, a moral relativist. I don't believe that something's moral just because, 3 minutes, wow, just because your culture says it's correct. One of the examples that I've used for talking about secular morality is a chessboard. Take a mid-game chess position and present it to a bunch of people who are experts in chess and some people who aren't, and ask them what's the best move. You may get a variety of answers. There may actually be a variety of best moves. And the answer to that question may have been different hundreds of years ago or 150 years ago when we didn't quite know as much about chess. The fact that we don't know everything, the fact that we cannot see all of the possibilities is not this terrifying prospect that Jay wants to make it out to be. It is actually an opportunity, and it requires us to actually study and learn about the reality we inhabit. That is how we got better at chess. That is how we get better at morality. The fact that you might get different answers doesn't mean that there's not an answer. Doesn't mean that there's not an answer that we may eventually find that is better. But there can be many good answers, and still the one person who's sitting over to the side saying, hey, you should just tip your king over, we don't have to consider that person, their input in processing, because they have clearly demonstrated that they do not understand the rules of the game. And by rules of the game, I'm not talking about rules the chess analogy fails because it's prescriptive, it was designed, but it doesn't matter if these are ultimately arbitrary or if they're by consensus or what. We inhabit reality, and reality has certain physical rules. There's certain things I can and can't do. If I punch you in the nose, it's going to hurt you. And I'd rather live in a world where people agree that we probably shouldn't run around punching each other in the nose. I don't even see that this is that hard. But when we get into debates about morality and people make claims about, oh, without a God, we can't have any objective moral standards, that's just hogwash. You can. It's a search. It's a process. And the fact that we don't have all the answers now doesn't mean we're not going to. Also, I'll point out that sticking God said so in as your objective moral standard doesn't resolve a single problem that Jay raised. It's no different from saying, because Matt said so.
All right, before we have the rebuttals, if you have a question, you fill that out. At this point, if they can all be passed to the left or to the right. My left, your right. If you do that, that would help immensely. Do that quickly.
They're gonna take about 2 minutes.
At this point then, each one of our debaters will have a cross-examination period of 6 minutes, and then after they've both had their chance, then we'll take that 10-minute break, and then after that we'll address the questions, they'll address the questions that you've submitted, all right? So 6 minutes each, and then we'll have that break.
Matt, do universal human rights exist?
No.
Do the people in this room have an inherent right to life?
No.
A few years ago in this community, and I want to say this so carefully, 14 people were gunned down. All of us here understand that that was against the law, it was illegal. But are you saying then that those 14 people had no inherent right to life?
Yes, I just said they don't.
Okay. So there was no rights violation?
No, there was a rights violation.
What was the basis of the right that was violated?
Rights are things that we grant. I'll expand a little bit if you want.
Yeah,
if you
real
allow.
carefully.
Sure.
I may have to cut you short.
Okay. Feel free. I just had a big discussion about this, about whether or not rights are granted by God, whether they're intrinsic or whatever. I don't think that they're intrinsic. I don't think that we can make any statement that says that somebody has intrinsic rights. Instead, we grant those rights. It's right there in the United States in our Declaration that we take them to be self-evident. They attributed it to a deity. I don't think they needed to.
Now, if in another society they choose not to grant those rights, that's okay?
Is it okay? I would say no.
Why is it wrong? How would you differentiate? Why can't one society choose one set of rights and another society totally reject those rights? What would be your standard for saying one society has
Sure.
it better than the other?
Sure. So you're looking for what is the objective standard for absolute morality, essentially?
No, but in connection with rights.
Well, I think they're all intertwined. The rights and freedoms and things. These are all the same question.
Okay, so
I mean, I can answer it. I don't know if you want me to go on with that or not.
no, okay, that'll be okay. But so just what you've said here is that there is no such thing as an inherent right to life. Rights are simply granted by what? Now, who grants them? A government, a society?
We do. The society.
Now, any right that there is granted under that method can also be revoked.
Yes,
Okay, and does that concern you at all?
of course.
Okay.
There's a difference between whether or not this is true and what I think about it.
Okay.
I'll point out.
Now, regarding moral values for a moment, because I think in the past, I sense you've been on two sides of this, and I just want to ask.
Very possibly. I used to be a Christian.
Well,
Sorry.
since you've been an atheist, here's my question. Do universal objective moral values exist?
I believe they do.
Now, Dr. Roos would say that's an illusion. What would you
I'd say I disagree.
agree with Russell that our beliefs are the result of the accidental arrangement of atoms in our brain, that the arrangement of atoms in our brain, the brain physiology affects and controls what our beliefs are.
I think so.
Then how can they be known to be true? If they're just electrochemical reactions following the physical laws of science, they just are. They're just happening. How can we...
They're not just happening.
Well, how can we know that they point to truth?
The thoughts in our head are beliefs. While they are just happening, they are just brain states. They don't just happen. It's not like I'm going to spontaneously think of a unicorn for no reason. Our thoughts are the result of the environment that we're in, our experiences. We process all of this. We form a model of the universe. This is what's happening inside the brain. This idea that we need, or that there can't be an absolute moral standard, is one that, in any given situation, there's a finite set of possible actions that one can take. And we know that some actions are better than others, even if we don't always establish criteria.
Okay, but you say we know this. We know that this is better than that. If the chemical processes in my brain draw a different conclusion about the superiority of those actions than the reactions in your brain, why should the functions of your brain be considered superior to mine just because we have different conclusions? What is the thing that enables two different people with two different brains to determine that one is right and one is wrong? Aren't they both under the same physical control?
That might be my favorite formulation of a question, by the way. What makes my brain better? But I shouldn't have done that. The answer is reason and evidence. The contrast between religious models of morality and secular models of morality is that religious models of morality are you are coerced or cajoled, and secular models, at least the modern ones that we're talking about, you are convinced through discussion and debate.
What if you're not convinced? What happens if I'm not convinced in your secular society?
Then we are in a disagreement, and one of us is right and one of us is not.
Will there be consequences imposed against me?
Quite possibly.
And that's-
Is that any different? Oh, sorry, I don't get to ask questions.
Okay. That's fine.
Oh, is that time? Okay, cool. Well, sure, I'll start with that. The fact that there's consequences imposed on you for not agreeing with me, isn't that the exact same situation we are at with you asserting that God has a certain view of morality that I don't agree with? Aren't there consequences imposed on me?
Yes, there are.
Okay, so there's really no difference in there.
Well, there's a huge difference. The difference being between a creature and a creator. And you may not recognize or respect that difference, but
I don't.
To equate the two and say, well, there's absolutely no difference between one creature putting consequences on another creature, that's no different than a creator who owns the universe. Everything in it belongs to him, but to say that those two operate on the same level, I just don't see how you can make that conclusion.
So a creator would be morally right in torturing somebody?
A creator. If you could give me an example of the God of Christianity torturing somebody, and we can just...
Hang on. I don't know what your version of hell is. Am I going to hell? Would you...
I don't know that.
Based on, I know you don't know, it's all up to God. Based on your understanding of Christian theology, as a non-believer, despite your assertion that I'm a believer, does your model dictate that I am most probably going to hell?
Yes.
And is hell a place of torment, or is your view kind of, you're not an annihilation theorist?
No.
Okay. So I'm going to be, according to your model, tormented. And this would be just because your God created me. He has the right to sentence me to that.
Yes.
Okay. If the Bible, which I'm going to assume is fair game since we're talking about the Christian model, the Bible clearly advocates slavery. It explicitly says who you can enslave, how you go about it, how much you can pay for them. It says that you can beat them as long as they don't die within a couple days. Yet, and this is supposedly, I'm guessing, the Word of God, and if God is the objective moral standard, and we think slavery is immoral, are we wrong?
Is slavery immoral?
Yes.
Okay. How do you know?
I'm asking you, is,
Okay.
your Bible says that it advocates slavery, and the current consensus view is that slavery is immoral. Are we wrong?
No, you're not wrong.
Okay. Is God wrong?
No, and I would say God did not advocate
Is the
slavery.
Bible wrong?
You see, you have to allow me to answer.
Okay.
Are you saying that,
Well, I
that
don't,
according
but I
to the
will.
Scripture, that God advocates slavery?
What I'm saying is that the law laid out in Exodus, which is ostensibly attributed to God, clearly advocates slavery.
No, it does not advocate slavery. What it does is regulate slavery. The law in the Old Testament is both ideal in the sense of the Ten Commandments. Jesus was once asked, what are the greatest commandments? And he said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength.
I got 3 minutes. Hey, can we
And-
stick with slavery?
And love your neighbor as yourself. That is the ideal ethic of the Old Testament. The Bible also explains, however, we live in a fallen world where sin has contaminated human relationships. God can either regulate or eradicate. Okay.
I'm
The Old Testament regulates slavery. Someday it will be eradicated, man.
So let me ask this then, since we're going to spin this. The Bible says that you're allowed to own slaves, correct?
You'd have to give me the chapter and verse.
Exodus 21
and
through
put it in
23.
context. Yes.
Okay. Since we're short on time, and since you're the only one who brought a Bible, on this subject of slavery, your position is that the Bible regulates slavery. Why wouldn't God simply come out and tell people don't own other human beings as property?
God does say, love your neighbor as yourself. If we did not live in a fallen world, there would be no slavery. God has also said that the day will come when he will bring judgment against things such as slavery.
Where's that?
That is in the epistles to Peter. And it also
It says slavery.
in that same passage says, but God is patient, not wanting any to suffer. Someday, all of the things that have gone wrong in humanity, including slavery, will be eradicated. It is
Why then, since I'm almost out of time, why then didn't God tell these Israelites when they were writing the Bible that is supposed to give you an instruction manual, instead of saying, hey, you can buy slaves for this much and you can beat them as long as they don't die, why isn't one of the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not own another human being? How hard would that be for God to say?
Will I be given adequate time
Go
to
ahead.
answer
I'm
this?
fine. That'll be my last question.
Okay. And I'm just going to ask, Matt, I know that was a long question. Just repeat it to me one more time.
Do I remember it? The Bible regulates slavery according to you. I say it clearly advocates it. And this is a problem because the Bible is a list of things that God supposedly conveyed to humanity. And among those are the 10 Commandments. Why would a moral, loving God who thinks that slavery is immoral and knows what's going to happen not include in the 10 Commandments, where he's got other things about graven images, thou shalt not own another human being as property, which is allowed in Deuteronomy to be passed on to your kids?
One of the things that makes the nature of that question not unfair but difficult in this setting is there's an air of equivocation going on here. I think most of you associate slavery with how it was experienced here in America 2 centuries ago in the Deep South. In the ancient Near East culture...
Hang on. I am going to let you finish. But this is kind of unfair because my specific formulation of the question was about owning people as property. It wasn't about American slavery or being mean.
And what I'm trying to say is that in the ancient Near East culture, in Israel, slavery was the social safety net. Do you know why slavery existed in the book of Exodus? It was to help people who could not pay their debts. It kept them out of debtor's prison. I'm sorry, but read the text in context. That's what it says. And at the end of every 7 years, those slaves were set free. And during the time of being in slavery, it was to pay off their financial debts, and they were given all sorts of rights and protections. And if we did not live in a fallen world, none of that would be necessary. But God in his mercy has provided a way of regulating life where relationships are contaminated by sin, and someday that problem will not be regulated, it will be eradicated.
Is that all? That was all of my time?
Yeah, do you want to go to that?
Sorry, what? Well, I don't know if I'm out of time.
Yeah.
I am out of time? Then let's...
I had extra time.
No, we'll move on. There's questions coming and a closing.
All right, thank you so much. 10 minutes, please be back here in time. That'd be great. If I can have your attention.
Oh, there's still questions. I thought we were on to closing.
No,
If I can have your attention. We'll now go to the questions from the audience, and after that, then we'll have our concluding remarks. And just as a reminder, just out of respect for what we're doing here and to both of our participants here, just to keep the audience response appropriate. I think that's important. I know that these are charged issues, and we're human beings, right? So we're going to feel real feelings there. But I just encourage you again, we're not enemies, we're opponents. This is a legitimate debate format, and out of respect, if we could keep it appropriate. All right, 3 questions for each. We'll alternate back and forth. There'll be 2 minutes for each person, each debater to respond, and then 1 minute rebuttal. So beginning with a question for Matt Dillahunty. Question is, would not the existence of God require that this God would be outside or above our natural understanding? Like me to read that again?
Sure.
Okay? Would not the existence of God require that this God be outside or above our natural understanding? 2 minutes.
Yeah, I don't completely know, and it's because there's many different God concepts that have been proposed, and not all of them are necessarily outside of the natural world. I think when we're talking about the Christian God, I think that by definition, or at least it is, my understanding is that it is described as existing outside the natural world, but I still, I don't understand what that even means. It's nothing to say that by definition something must be outside this world, because that doesn't tell me anything at all about whether or not it's true. First, we need a demonstration that it's possible for anything to be outside of space and time before we can even assess how likely it is that there's a God out in there. And there's no there. It's almost, I don't like arguing theological non-cognitivism, because I don't believe that the God concept is utterly incomprehensible. I believe that there are plenty of definitions of God that are at least comprehensible, and therefore we can debate them, which is why I would agree to debate the existence of God. But I don't know what it means to be outside space-time, and I don't care if by definition it must be. You can't define a God into existence.
Okay, 1 minute response.
One of the beauties of the Christian God as described in Scripture is that he is both transcendent to the universe, and I think that's what was behind that question, but he is also immanent within it. And the greatest of the occurrences of his immanence in this universe is the incarnation of the Son of God, Jesus Christ. Christian theology is not either or, it's both and when it comes to God's relationship to time. And so that, I think, was perhaps overlooked in that question. There is a sense in which in his transcendence he's unknowable, but in his immanence he's very knowable, and he has revealed himself to us in many ways, one of which is the operation of the human moral conscience that works within each of us.
All right, first question for Jay Lucas. If everyone feels guilt and has an inner sense of morality, then how do you explain sociopaths? Sociopaths are people who have no moral sense. They're estimated to be about 3% of the population.
Yes, and we would always make those exceptions and add to it the severely mentally retarded, perhaps somebody who has suffered a severe brain injury. And I think within Christian theology, there would be no moral blame put on that person. It's just when you have such a short period of time to define and describe a position, all of those extra caveats, which, are very useful and very helpful, you just can't always squeeze all of that in the short period of time. But I think Christian theology would make very clear that there would be exceptions to that for the reasons that you suggested and the additional ones I just suggested. Severe retardation, severe brain injury, those sorts of things would be exceptions, and there would not be moral guilt in those cases.
I think those caveats are the bread and butter of morality that we need to look at, and we can't do it until we get past arguing over silly stuff that we should have resolved ages ago. I find it curious that a sociopath might have no moral blame. Not that I necessarily agree that they should be blamed, but I find it curious that Jay's advocating a God who created a universe, stuck us in it, and then put 3% of the population as sociopaths to run around causing havoc, and they have no moral blame. What's the purpose of that? I don't see it. Not that it's false, it's baffling to me.
Okay. Second question for Matt. Would you agree that the life of Jesus Christ, which is documented in the scriptures and by several well-respected historians of the first century, is more than anecdotal evidence of the existence of God? He never failed to claim to be anything other than God and proved it with the resurrection.
Wow, one more time, just so I get all the bits of it.
Yep. Would you agree the life of Jesus Christ, which is documented in the scriptures and by several well-respected historians of the first century, is more than anecdotal evidence of the existence of God? He never failed to claim to be anything other than God and proved it with the resurrection.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't agree, and I don't agree with the information in the question that it's actually factual. First of all, we don't find any first century historians until Josephus, who was at least born after the purported time that Jesus would have existed and didn't start writing until the end of the first century. He couldn't have been an eyewitness. The characterization of Jesus as never doing anything other than claiming that he was God isn't consistent. The character and statements of Jesus in the four Gospels is notoriously inconsistent, to where, John's God, or John's Jesus is kind of a no-nonsense, yep, I'm here, I'm the Son of God, take no prisoners. And Luke's Jesus is kind of this zen, unflappable Jesus. And Mark and Matthew have different Jesuses where, Matthew's is most definitely Jewish, John's is most definitely anti-Jewish. And the resurrection is nothing that has been confirmed. These are our stories. I don't know whether or not they're true. I don't have any good reason to think they're true. But we have no extra biblical contemporary evidence for any significant factor about Jesus' life.
That is simply not true. There is an abundance of historical evidence. What you've just seen demonstrated is what I mentioned in my opening statement of how presuppositions control how a person interprets evidence. Time does not permit us, maybe we should do a debate on the historicity of Jesus Christ. But do you remember the quote from the Second Humanist Manifesto when it said that anything we discover in the future will but add to our knowledge of the natural? You see, if you have a presupposition that excludes the supernatural from the very outset, no historical evidence is going to be seen as compelling.
Okay. Second question now then for Jay Lucas. Question. You assert that objective morality is evidence for God's existence. Suppose for a moment that someone convinced you that no God exists. Would you then feel free to lie, cheat, steal, murder, and rape at will? Why or why not?
Okay, I think that's I mean this in the technical sense, Matt, that's a complex question. So first of all, Steve, I'm going to have to ask you to read it again. Okay. And you have to understand that there's more than one issue being asked in this question, and that's going to make it a little unfair. But if you could just read it one more time.
Sure. Question. You assert that objective morality is evidence for God's existence. Suppose for a moment that someone convinced you that no God exists. Would you then feel free to lie, cheat, steal, murder, and rape at will? Why or why not?
I believe I would feel that I could justify that course of action if I chose to take it. The claim tonight has never been that atheists are immoral or are not capable of doing good. I would say quite the contrary, but the reason for that capability is the common grace of God. Now, if I did not believe that God existed, nevertheless, the nature of this universe, God's common grace, I think, would still restrain me. But let's say there truly is no God and there is no common grace. I would say this. I don't know if I would make those choices or not. I just know this, that if I chose to take that course of action, I could justify it. By the way, anybody here who's ever cheated on an exam in this university found a way to rationalize and justify it, even if you ultimately do not believe it was the right thing to do. We're always capable of finding rationalizations, but that doesn't mean that we're always going to do the worst possible thing. Not at all.
I agree. I'll expand for a second. Yes, the non-existence of a God doesn't necessitate, wow, that was a clumsy word, doesn't make it necessarily true that someone is going to take certain actions. Just like the belief that a God exists doesn't necessarily make it true that people are going to take certain actions. I think even Jay would agree that there are a number of Christians who sincerely believe that a God exists and understand what God's moral view is supposedly, and yet still go out and do evil things. So this isn't about what somebody can do or would do. You can say.
Yeah, I can
Okay.
do that.
I figured a quick yes wouldn't infringe on the rules. Go ahead.
All right, final question for Matt. You said that perceptions of morality have changed, but morality itself has not. Where did that morality come from, and can you use an analogy that doesn't fail? And I don't know what that means, but
I know what it means. I'm just, what a curious way to end the question.
Before Matt answers that, because I'm also trying to prepare a response, could you read that one more time? I
Yes.
couldn't quite hear the last few words.
okay, yes. You said that perceptions of morality have changed, but morality itself has not. Where did that morality come from, and can you use an analogy that doesn't fail? In parentheses, I'm sorry, it says chess. All right, so can you use an analogy that doesn't fail?
The chess analogy may not fail in the way that that person's thinking it does, but I understand what you're saying. The change, take for example, slavery, because I'm going to talk about that again. Once upon a time, people considered slavery to not be immoral. Now we consider it moral. Where did that come from? Does that mean that slavery used to actually be moral? My position is that no, it was always immoral, but those who were practicing it did not recognize that. And the recognition of this comes from a broadened understanding. It comes from eliminating certain biases and prejudices. It comes from restructuring the way you look at the world so that you now have if you don't think that we have a better understanding of reality and human interaction and the consequences of our actions than Bronze Age people who wrote that slavery was okay, I don't know what to tell you, but we do. And that's a great thing. Everything we know from both with regard to morality and science, we are standing on the shoulders not necessarily of giants, but of billions of people who thought things out ahead of us. It wasn't moral then and became immoral. It was always immoral. It's just that people didn't have the understanding necessary to recognize it, and that comes through experience.
If experience is the standard of testing morality, and it's always changing and evolving, then using that logic, and in this sense, I would almost agree with at least part of what Matt said. I fully expect that 200 years from now, people will look back at our culture and the legalization of abortion and say, what were those people thinking? You see, is it not possible that as we further evolve our ethical standards and sensitivities, that the things that we accept as moral now will someday be considered immoral? You have not really escaped relativity or moral relativism in the position that you staked out, because we are always changing. And wherever change can take place, things are relative to change.
All right. One final question for Jay. Question. How and why is Christian theism more correct than other religions? Example, Judaism, Islam, etc. In other words, why are alternatives to Christianity not correct?
In 2 minutes?
And just consider this, Jay. What can I possibly say about this question in my 1 minute?
Well, if I could,
You can have all three.
Before I start those 3 minutes, I'm going to erase all of these obnoxious criticisms of Matt that I was going to make in my last statement. Thank you for that extra minute. In a sense, Steve, it's a wonderful, wonderful question. It's not really right in this debate because we're not here to debate other religions. Other religions can have their turn if they would like, but that's not what this debate was supposed to be about. But the fundamental difference, I would say, between Christianity and other religions can be summarized in these simple concepts. Do versus done. You see, all of the religions in the world and all the different gods can all be boiled down to this essential claim that the way to heaven or salvation or nirvana, whatever it is based on what you do. Christianity is unique in this regard. The central claim of Christianity is that our hope is not in what we do, it's in what has been done for us. And that makes it unique against every other religion of the world. All of the other religions, although on the surface have so many dissimilarities, boil them down, and essentially they all make that same claim that whatever the afterlife holds for us, the way to prepare for that is fundamentally dependent on what we do. Christianity stands alone in its uniqueness, personified and ultimately manifested in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who in his dying breath said these words, "It is finished." The work that we need to have our sins forgiven has been done completely for us. And that makes Christianity truly unique among all the religions of the world. And I believe, by the way, and I don't mean to offend our Jewish friends here tonight, that Christianity and Judaism are not at odds with one another. There's currently obviously disagreements in the relationship between the two testaments of Scripture, Hebrew and Greek, or Old and New. But we would say as Christians that Judaism is the very pillar and foundation upon which Christianity stands. Take away Judaism, there is no Christianity.
All right. Now we'll have closing statements, 5 minutes each. And just as Jay Lucas had the opening position for the debate, we're going to have Matt Dillahunty have the final statement. All right, so 5 minutes each.
All right, so me first and then Matt.
Correct.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Matt has made an issue of slavery and tells me that he's going to do that in his final statement. In Matthew 19, Jesus was asked why God permitted Moses to issue certificates of divorce. And the reason God regulated divorce was to deal with the nature of life and human relationships in a fallen world. But in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, where marriage is first created and ordained, there is no divorce. God's perfect and holy design for marriage is the two shall be one, and they shall remain one until death do they part. But because sin enters into that afterwards, all human relationships on every level are corrupted. God chooses then to provide a series of laws and systems that as mercifully as possible regulate relationships in a fallen world, with the understanding that someday that which has been distorted will be restored. So everything that Matt's going to say about the injustice and unfairness of God in his dealings with slavery, I think misses the central point. Yes, God could eradicate slavery right now. He could also eradicate all sorts of other things right now. He's chosen not to because in his patience he's withholding the ultimate day of judgment where all those things will be made right. And why has he not yet brought that day of judgment? I believe it's an act of mercy towards each of us. I'm reminded of the words of the Apostle Paul in a setting similar to this in ancient Athens. dealing with philosophers who were questioning him, he said this: "The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and he does not live in temples built by hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything, because he himself gives all men life and breath and everything else. From one man he made every nation of men, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he determined the time set for them in the exact places where they should live." God did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out and find him, though he is not far from each of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by man's design or skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance. But now he commands all people everywhere to repent, for he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed, Jesus Christ. He has given proof of this to all people by raising him from that dead, and on that day there will never again be slavery. Why is it that Matt strives to be honest and to do good things? Why does he have the moral concerns that he's raising about slavery? I have no doubt that many who know him would testify to his kindness. I believe that Matt not only wants to be that kind of person, he believes he ought to be that kind of person. I believe that to be true of you in the audience as well. Living up to certain moral standards is not just a calculated response to the avoidance of negative consequences and the attainment of positive utilitarian outcomes. In our hearts, we know that some things are absolutely right and other things are absolutely wrong. Our moral consciences can defend us or accuse us depending on the circumstances we are in and the choices we make regarding our moral duties. This phenomenon only makes sense because the universe is not what the atheist says it is. We are not the result of an unplanned cosmic accident. We don't live in a purposeless universe where man's beliefs are determined by the accidental arrangement of atoms. In my opening presentation, I suggested we assume, for the sake of the argument, the presupposition that there is no God and that the universe reduces to matter in motion, leaving us without any ultimate foundations for ethics or human free will in our moral actions. Given the ultimate presupposition of atheism, can we build a rationally consistent worldview that does justice to the moral conscience at work within us? I say you can't. However, if we believe God exists and that his righteous character and essential holiness provides the foundation for the existence of objective moral values, can we build a rationally consistent worldview that does justice to the moral conscience that each of us has? I believe the answer is yes, for indeed, God does exist, and you can know him. Thank you.
Did you arrange that? I'm a skeptic. I don't know Jay very well. We met this morning. Generally, I like him. We talk about all kinds of things, including, kids and stuff. I think he's probably a nice guy, too. I don't think anybody'd say a bad word about him. I won't. And it doesn't give me any pleasure to beat up on him. But to start off with regards to slavery, what Jay said about the 7-year thing is a misrepresentation or a misunderstanding of the text. The fact is, Exodus 21:2 says that if you buy a Hebrew servant, which was illegal for you to own Hebrew slaves, but if you buy a fellow Jew as a slave, they could only serve you for 6 years, and then you had to let them go. The prohibition against keeping slaves after 7 years only applied to Jews. Everybody else, as you'll find in Leviticus 25 through 44, 25, 44 through 46, you buy the heathens from around you as slaves, and they are your property forever, and you pass them on to your kids. And by the way, the Bible also includes a way around this law about keeping a Jewish slave for more than 7 years. If he comes in by himself, he goes out by himself. But if you have a Jewish slave and you give him a wife, he either has to leave and leave his wife with you, or he has to say, no, I love my wife, I love my master, in which case you take him to the town elders, you drive a spike through his ear, which is really nothing more than piercing the ear, it's symbolic, it's not torturous, and he becomes your property forever. That's the facts about what the Bible says. Exodus 21, Leviticus 25. As to the presupposition of atheism, I have no presupposition of atheism. My atheism may in fact be the result of other presuppositions, which I will happily investigate. But atheism isn't some monolithic thing. It's a single position on a single issue. On the claim that our presuppositions prevent us from looking at history and saying that that we're stuck saying X can't be supernatural. That's not the fact. What we're saying is that X cannot be confirmed as supernatural, and that no anecdote can ever be considered sufficient evidence to justify a mystery. I mentioned I found it curious we're having this debate in the 21st century. I would have found it more curious about 15 years ago when I was still a Christian, because it would have never occurred to me to question the existence of God. So irrespective of where you sit on this issue, before the debate, after the debate, forever, I want to applaud all you for at least coming to hear the discussion. I don't think I've changed Jay's mind. Jay hasn't changed my mind. I think it's likely that neither of us have changed a mind in today's audience. So why do I do this? I'll tell you why I do this. I do this so that the information is available to others. I do this because I used to believe, but I no longer believe. And this is because others were brave enough to challenge the common knowledge assertion that a God exists. I do this so that organizations like the Secular Student Alliance can continue to grow and encourage the next generation to stand up in support of the rights and freedoms of the non-religious. I do this so that organizations like the Campus Bible Fellowship are able to work together with organizations like the SSA, because we've been divided for far too long. The question of God's existence is something that must be debated, or we risk entering another era where it is the social standard to hold it unquestionable, and down that path lies dogma and despair. Any claim that is asserted to be beyond question should be, I think, beneath contempt. People will claim that religions have done marvelous things. I disagree. I think people have done marvelous things and that they often credit religion. I find no example of a true and good thing that requires religious belief, and I find the representation of religion as some kind of monolithic, mostly good thing to be an equivocation fallacy. Religions often promote divisiveness, encouraging an us and them mentality. Religions often retard real progress by asserting to have answers. They prohibit us or inhibit us from finding the real answers. Religions are afforded privileged status in our country and around the world, and privilege is necessarily unfair and unjust. If one group is treated favorably, then other groups' treatment is diminished. I hope that I've convinced someone to abandon their religious beliefs. It's happened before. Maybe it has happened tonight. Maybe it hasn't. But more than that, I hope we've encouraged someone to rethink their views about God and about atheists. A recent survey showed atheists to be the least trusted minority in America. That view is a product of misinformation produced by religions and religious people. The fact that Jay and I don't agree on the existence of God doesn't tell you much about what sort of person we are. It doesn't tell you much about which of us is more trustworthy, more moral, more honest, more loving, more compassionate, more intelligent, or more correct. I'm here to do my small part and to encourage others to do the same. When we stop debating over gods and what they want us to do, we can begin to do a much better job of debating the real issues that result in real injustices to real people every single day.
I'd like to thank both of our debaters, Jay Lucas and Matt Dillahunty, for a great evening. I hope that you enjoyed it. I think it's definitely instructive. Before I dismiss our time, though, let me just, as a service to our two student groups, just remind the follow-up events that are coming here. For the Campus Bible Fellowship, on April 23rd at 7 p.m. in Old Union 252, there'll be a time of get-together to basically think about and discuss this debate. That'll be led by Dave and Vicki McGrew. And then April 26th at 7:30 p.m. in New Union 324, that will be led by Dr. Ken Gardosky. The other side with Secular Student Alliance on April 25th at 6 p.m. in FA 247, short presentation and discussion on non-religiosity in the African American community. And then May 3rd, it's CA 114, that great blood drive. All right. Thank you and have a good evening.